Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I'm Chris Weave. This is Starfleet Tactical. I have Lissa here as always. How have you been, Lissa?
I've been doing all right.
So Lissa earlier was showing me the kitten. The kitten is as cute as ever.
Where's she at? I always it's like toddlers. When they're quiet, you worry.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. TJ Cizadlo has an interesting comment about last show, and I think it's actually going to be something I'm going to kind of address in this show. So
he corrected himself. Which was not last week.
It wasn't last week. But the last show I interpreted it.
Yeah, what, 2 weeks ago? Maybe more at this point.
It was 2 weeks ago. I've been so busy. I've been running all over hell because I was I went back to Des Moines for my 40th high school reunion. I went back, first of all, for the Wee family. Actually, it was more than 2 weeks ago. I was off the last 2 weeks because I went to the Wee family reunion on a Sunday, and then the following Saturday I had my 40th high school reunion. So I missed both those Saturdays.
Mm.
And so that was a lot of fun.
You've been out of high school longer than I've been alive, Chris.
Yeah. That happens. I was talking with one of my coworkers yesterday, and he said we were talking about allergy shots because his mother actually works in the practice where I get allergy shots. And I said, well, I've been doing allergy shots for a while. I had my first allergy shots a long time ago. And he said, oh, like the 90s? And I said, no, the 70s. Because I started getting allergy shots when I was like 12.
Oh, wow.
And so that would have been 12 or 13, which would have been like 77.
Mm-hmm.
So, because 40th high school reunion, that happens. So
yes, it does.
So, but let's see. So Pat is not here tonight, obviously. Pat is now, I think today was the day that he was going to have the official retirement ceremony, but I think he's officially retired from the Naval Reserve. But he's still busy with the day job. The day job's keeping him busy. But I'm hoping that he'll be able to tag in at some point in the near future, and we can talk about Babylon 5 and stuff. And I've got some ideas to sort of standardize things. Like there's a friend of mine who's interested in being a guest host, and he may come on and be a guest host like once a month or so. But that's all sort of up in the air. It's just been crazy these days. So
that's a mood.
Yes.
Some of us predate the moon landing. I'm aware. I'm just saying this to remind you guys.
Yeah, I do not remember Apollo 11. I was 4. I do remember Apollo 17. So, because one of the things that I think people don't fully appreciate is how fast and furious a lot of those Apollo missions came.
I know.
They were and all throughout the space program, they were doing, it wasn't unusual to have launches a month apart, all the way through the space program. And so it was pretty, pretty rock and roll, pretty fast all the time. There were exceptions, right? After Apollo 13, they called all stop for a while. After the Apollo 1 fire, they called an all stop for a while they figured out exactly what happened. But for a lot of those, they were like a month or two apart. I think they were like
Apollos 8 through 11 were on roughly 2-month centers.
Yeah. So they were sort of cranking things through, and they ended up in situations where they had their plan. Eisenhower famously said, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything." And by that, what he meant was you never execute the plan that you planned for, right? But
there's execute the plan, throw out the plan.
Yeah,
because none of the plan ever. It's the same in D&D and everything like that. If you have a plan in tabletops or anything like that, no, you have a bullet point.
but the importance of planning is that you've thought through a bunch of the issues, you understand what your capabilities are, you've got all the information readily at hand. So planning is important, even if you know that you're not actually going to execute that plan. And you also figure out what's going to work and what isn't going to work, and you throw stuff out. And so there were places during the Apollo program where the plan, where they weren't going to be ready with one particular part of the plan. And so they ended up calling an audible and switching things around. This is how Apollo 8 ended up going to the moon, and then Apollo 9 was in Earth orbit. And that was specifically because Apollo 8, they were supposed to do it the other way around, but they weren't going to have, if I remember correctly, they weren't going to have the LEM ready. And so they said, why don't we swap the missions? We need to do a moon mission. We need to actually go around the moon. Let's go ahead and do that and make sure we've got all that stuff working. And then we'll test the lunar module in Earth orbit afterwards. And I don't remember whether they swapped crews around or anything like that. I need to go back and reread Chaikin, which is sort of the definitive book on the Apollo program. There's a lot of really good books on the Apollo program, but Chaikin is the one that when Tom Hanks was making From Earth to the Moon, if there was any doubt about what actually happened, somebody on the staff would say, well, what did Chaikin say about that? And it's a really good book. And I think there's an Audible book for it. I think I remember listening to it. So, but tonight, the plan I came up with is to talk a little bit about space-going aircraft carriers, and sort of feeding off what I did last week. So I'll be honest, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what exactly was what I wanted to do tonight, because I want to do a show on sort of assumptions in this, about how different assumptions lead you to different answers, like the assumptions about whether you have a tactically useful faster than light drive, or whether you have a faster than light sensors, and how all these things play together, et cetera, et cetera. But that's going to be, it's not conceptually difficult, but sort of it needs to gel a little bit more. So I decided I needed to leave that one in the fridge and let it get a little bit firmer before I was ready to actually put the presentation together. But I decided that a good topic to talk about is go back and talk about space-going aircraft carriers. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. And so let me go ahead and bring that up. Right. Okay.
All right. And with that, I am behind.
See you later. Okay. So we're now exclusively on the Aries Studio channels. Tell your friends, tell your family, take out ads in the New York Times, let everybody know. I was actually I was hoping to do the Facebook page today, but I just ended up spending a bunch of the day reading and working on slides and stuff. Not a whole lot of time working on slides, as will become obvious when we get to the actual slides. There we've got the schedule and what we think we're going to do. Next week is a no. I will be out of town at a gaming convention. I think it's a yes the 2 weeks after that, but there's a few other things that are up in the air. There's a very good possibility that one of those 2 weeks I will make a trip back to Iowa, probably on the 2nd is more likely. And depending upon exactly when I go back, it may or may not actually work out. Plans are everything, or plans are nothing, planning is everything. Right now, I'm planning to do a show, but we'll see if that actually ends up happening. And then the 16th and the 23rd, I'm going to be in Alabama, but I hope that when I come back, I will have some pictures of the USS Alabama, because if things work out well, in between the week 1 and week 2 of being down there, I'm going to try to go down and see the USS Alabama. It's unclear as to whether that's actually going to happen or not. It sort of depends upon how the setup for the event goes in the first week. So let's see. Let me go on to the next slide. Talking about fighters and torpedo boats. This is still part of that overall, but it's not. It's really, what I'm really going to do tonight is I'm going to go back and revisit a topic that I talked about a while ago. Specifically, thought I put it in here. Oh yeah, I did. That's on the next slide. Specifically, I'm going to go back and do a quick refresh on what is a fighter. I talked about that a couple of weeks ago in the last episode. I'm going to look at what I said in the past from my presentation on aircraft carriers in space. I'm going to take a look at a couple of models on how you can think about this that are a little bit different than what I did the last time. And then I'll try to summarize all this. So this is really very much of a work in progress. This is not something, you know, a lot of the stuff that I've done, the presentations, I've got artwork, I've sort of, everything's very consistent, et cetera, et cetera. You guys are in effect seeing working notes. I am trying to sort of figure everything out. I'm sort of sorting through it all in my head. I haven't figured out the proper way to present all this stuff, but I'm sort of giving it to you in as close to real time as I can. You know, looking forward to any feedback that you might have. And as part of that, I reserve the right to come back and sort of put it all together and do a more formal presentation at some point in the future. But in the meantime, you're sort of seeing how my thinking has evolved in all of this as I'm working my way through the fighters and in space problem. Oh, you know what? I think I got these out of order because of course I do. Let's see. So this is the presentation I did back Starfleet Tactical episode number 39 in March of 2021. I did this presentation, and this is a presentation I've been doing for a while back then. I mean, I've been doing this particular presentation for 10 plus years. And so I did it on the show, and I'm going to go through this relatively fast. I'm not going to do the whole thing again. I'm only going to do a piece of it. Yeah. So I got my slides out of order. But before I do that, let's talk about what is a fighter. This is a slide that I used a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to say fighter. I'm really talking about attack aircraft in a lot of instances. I'm talking about, you know, in the real world, I'm talking about airplanes that fly off of aircraft carriers. I'm not going to talk about things that are sort of deploy from the planet. I'm primarily talking about things that come off of carriers because when push comes to shove, this is about Navy stuff. And that's really where the high performance Navy stuff is. And in the real world, you know, you attack ships with strike aircraft, not with fighters. But, you know, they can be fighter bombers. They can be fighter attack aircraft like the FA-18 on the right-hand side. But when I say fighter, I'm really talking about all of this. When it's important to differentiate, I will. And there we have sort of the general attributes of it. As a general rule, the things to keep in mind is carriers don't move in the real world. Carriers are practically stationary compared to the fighters. Carriers have endurance that's hundreds of times the endurance of the fighters. They're 1,000 times the size of the crew. But they dramatically underperform in terms of performance. They're dramatically greater in terms of endurance, but in terms of speed, et cetera. And so basically having an aircraft carrier is a way of having your cake and eating it too. You get all the advantages of a ship and all the advantages of an airplane. So in that talk, the aircraft carriers in space talk, this is the bottom line up front. As you can tell, I've changed the size of my slides and I need to go back and fix those slides. I decided not to bother fixing it for this because I wanted it to sort of look like it did before, and this is the best way to do that. The bottom line up front is that naval platforms are defined by the media in which they operate. And so that's why ships are capable of having large capacity and long endurance, but they're limited in their speed, whereas airplanes, because of the properties of air, have a lot different characteristics. Carriers are a way of having your cake and eating it too. And most space-going aircraft carriers seem to ignore the differences in the media that drive the problem. Now, the thing for tonight I'm going to talk about is other differences that might lead you to some interesting alternatives that are not based upon the media, because of course the media is the same. The media is space. But what are some other differences that can lead to some that are worth thinking about in terms of aircraft carriers, and I'm going to specifically focus on hybrid aircraft carriers. So I presented some examples from science fiction, pure carriers, hybrid aircraft carriers, and battleships. And I'll note that for that pure carriers, I'm going to approach that a little bit differently this time. Torpedo boat carriers and hybrid torpedo boat carriers. Now, that's how I presented it the last time. I'm going to breeze through those slides real quick, but that's really not quite the way I'm going to look at it this time. So Battlestar Galactica, you've got fighters. In the case of the more recent one, you have the Raptor also, which has some interesting capabilities, but really it was all about the fighters. You saw the new Battlestar Galactica, a little bit of instances of greater ordnance. The new Battlestar Galactica was a much more... we were not seeing the colonial fleet as it trained to fight. We were seeing what happens when they had the resources that they had, and so they were basically changing their doctrine and their tactics to deal with what they had. So in Stargate and Babylon 5, you've got these ideas of things that are basically space-going battleships that also carry fighters along with them. In the case of Stargate, it's clearly more carrier-ish. In the case of Babylon 5, it's less carrier-ish, but in both cases, they're carrying fighters along with functioning as, having big guns and functioning as a combat unit themselves. In Scott Geyer's Ganellan series, you've got corvettes. That's the thing that you're seeing up front, which has a crew of about 10 people, maybe a little bit more than that. And you've got motherships, and these basically function like torpedo boats or like small combatants. They are arranged in squadrons, and they sort of deploy and go out and do stuff like fighters. Not surprising. Geyer is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, and he had been on an aircraft carrier and assigned to a squadron, and that's how he approached it. I actually, when I first read his stuff, I hypothesized that he had been a P3 guy. I almost got it correct, but he had indeed been a naval graduate, and the books are great. I'm currently rereading the second one even as we speak. Then we've also got Honor Harrington, which also looks a lot like torpedo boats in terms of the light attack craft. And so we see a light attack craft and we see a couple of LAC carriers. Note, not to the same scale. If you look very carefully, you can see down in the lower left-hand corner exactly what a Shrike light attack craft looks like. And that's the same thing as the thing in the middle. That's what it looks like to scale. And then the hybrid torpedo boat carriers, I talked about C.J. Cherry's Alliance Union Universe, which I also talked about last week. Okay, 2 more slides on this, if I remember correctly. First of all, the implications for space-going fighters is that it was unclear to me at best why most science fiction fighters would make sense in this environment because of a lack of endurance and maybe a lack of ship-killing weapons, although, throw a couple of nukes on, you should be able to solve that problem. I'm going to approach that differently tonight. So write that conclusion down in pencil, because I think maybe I'm changing it. Torpedo boat carriers may make more sense in this regard, and that may still be true. I think that actually is probably a little bit better, especially in situations where you need to have a little bit more endurance. If you had to sit in a cockpit for 4 days, I suspect it would get really old. At least with something that looked more like a torpedo boat, you could get up and stretch your legs every now and then. So, and I see a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to try to go back and answer them at the end. Okay, implications for space-going aircraft carriers. Hybrids look much better if you don't need a flight deck, because a modern aircraft carrier is really built around a flight deck. And if you don't need that, the idea that you can just sort of you don't need to build a special ship to make aviation work. If that's the case, then having some aviation assets available is probably a good thing. But the details really do matter in terms of how you figure that out. Okay, so let's drill down a little bit on this hybrid space-going aircraft carriers piece. So the hybrids are the ones where you are combining something that looks like a battleship, kind of acts like a battleship, with something that looks like an aircraft carrier. Now, in the real world, that hybrid doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for a bunch of reasons. One is that you really do have to design your ship around the flight deck. A flight deck that is half as long is much, 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 much less than half as useful as a full-size flight deck. And then you also have issues where, like, if you've got an aircraft carrier, you're constantly worried about sailing into the wind. You're not maneuvering against the enemy force. Whereas battleships, the battle line was all about maneuvering large numbers of ships in concert to be able to concentrate firepower where you needed it against the enemy's battle line. And so that was all about maneuvering the ships in one way. Aircraft carriers are all about maneuvering ships in another way. And then when you add on to the fact that aircraft carriers have to be very high up in the water, and if you want to armor them, that means you've got armor really high up, which means that you've got some stability issues. So you can never armor an aircraft carrier in the same way that you can armor a battleship. And so the last thing in the world you want to do is take that aircraft carrier anywhere near a battleship's guns firing back at you. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the real world. But we see it happen in science fiction a few times, and let's take a look at a few instances where we see this sort of thing happen and see if maybe we can make these hybrid aircraft carriers work. See what sort of combat models might actually work for this. So I'm going to take a look at 4 of them. I'm going to look at the original Battlestar Galactica. I'm going to look at the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. I'm going to look at something that, let's call it the Jovian Chronicles type. I'm going to look at Jovian Chronicles, which was an old RPG and associated miniatures game from DreamPod 9 back in, call it 15, 20 years ago. And then I'm going to take another look at Cherry's Alliance Union Universe stuff again. And so you can think of all these as sort of archetypes. I'm not saying that these are specifically the ones. I'm saying that, this is sort of like, you think of these as the categories in which you can put stuff. Somebody said, Entropy 11 says, Jovian pulls hard from the inspiration of Gundam. Gundam in its various flavors leans heavily into the hybrid carrier. I will admit, I've never actually seen any of the Gundam stuff. So that's a failing, and that's a research failing on my part. I need to go do that. But that's not inconsistent with what I've heard. Okay, so the original Battlestar Galactica, I'll start off with the caveat. It's a TV show, right? And this is true of all TV shows. They may have a series Bible and they may just ignore it. And the writers haven't necessarily spent as much time thinking about this as we do. And so a lot of the details and sometimes, even if they have, the details get changed or left out because it's a TV show. And so you end up with a lot of muddled details, muddled at best, and this one's especially bad, about speed, range, and all these other details. Things that you really kind of need to do to put it all together, they just don't tell you. Like, I presume that the fighters have FTL capability, but then again, they don't really talk about any of the ships having FTL capability. They just sort of cruise. So what does that mean? I don't know. There's plenty of other problems that aren't relevant for today also, which is, I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by pew-pew going forward. But overall, the original Battlestar Galactica was pretty much a World War II carrier model. Fighters dramatically outperformed the carrier in terms of speed and maneuverability. The carrier dramatically outperforms the fighters in terms of endurance and capacity. The weapons that the Galactica had in most instances are primarily defensive, although at the end of the one and only season, at one point, they all of a sudden had these big offensive missiles that sort of came out of nowhere. But up until that point, all you really saw were turrets that were sort of self-defense weapons, which is really kind of what we ended up settling on for carriers, at least in the U.S. Navy. And the carrier, if things are going well, the carrier doesn't see combat at all. Now, empirically, what always ended up happening in Battlestar Galactica was the Cylons would come and attack the Galactica, and sometimes the Galactica would go and attack the Cylons. The Galactica's air wing would go and attack the Cylons, but usually it was the Cylons were coming and attacking the Galactica. But the goal was not to get the Galactica into the fight. The Galactica was the base ship. The goal was for the fighters to take the fight to the Cylons if they possibly could. It wasn't about, the Galactica. If the Galactica never actually fired its weapons, the Galactica is having a good day. So let's take a look at the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. In this, you do have some discussion about FTL capability in that the Galactica has it and the fighters do not. Now, the Raptors do have it. I would argue that the Raptors were designed to perform 4 roles. You see them do some attack stuff at some points in it, but that's kind of rare. You see them function as transport duties. So I think they were the light transports, and an FTL capability was useful for that. They also were scouts, and so an FTL capability is useful for that. And they were AEW birds, and for that, I don't know that they necessarily needed the FTL capability for that, but they did airborne early warning, that sort of stuff, and they did electronic warfare sorts of stuff, and those things it was useful for them to have a larger platform to do that. But apparently there seems to be some sort of size limit, and that's about at the point where you can start putting an FTL drive on. You didn't see fighters with any sort of FTL capability. So you got strategic mobility from the carrier, and you got tactical mobility from the fighters. And so now we do see in the TV show, they're limited, aside from just the fact that it's a TV show and all the reasons I talked about for the original series, you also have the issue with they're primarily on the defensive. So the entire series, they're in a situation where they're protecting the fleet. They are not doing all the things that they would normally do. They rarely go on the offensive. When they do, it's an egregious situation. It's about them providing cover for the fleet. And so as a result, I don't think they did everything. We did not see their entire playbook. They also had very limited resources after the Holocaust. We didn't see their entire playbook. But it seems to me that the way their playbook works goes like this. That when their scouts tell them that there's a place where there's a target to attack, like a base star or something like that, the Battlestar jumps in and immediately launches a strike from its fighters. That's why you have all those launch tubes, so that you can get the strike out fast, right? It's all about quick reaction. And you see them do a combat landing where everybody comes in and lands at the same time. So that's why you have big, wide flight pods, so that they can have multiple landings taking place simultaneously. And that's also why you see them having the ability to launch a whole bunch of ships simultaneously. So all those things are very, that's about the Battlestar jumping in and launching that strike. Now, at that point, the Battlestar is pretty close to the battle. And it's got a lot of armor, and it's got some offensive punch, and it's also got some defensive stuff. But it seems clear to me that the idea of the Battlestar is that it wades into the fight, and the fighters help deal with both protect the Battlestar, because the Battlestar's got bigger guns than the fighters do, but also the fighters could go off and do a strike. And so it's a much, much different approach than anything that we see in the real world. If there's an analog, it's not naval. It's not naval, and I'm not quite sure what it is. But that seems to me that that's kind of what ends up happening, although we don't really see that. We don't really see that in the show, and I think that's entirely because they're entirely on the defensive. We do see other instances in not Razor, the web episodes with Adama. I think actually some of that actually showed up in Blood and Chrome, if I remember correctly. We see instances where they're like defending a target, right? If you're defending something, you may be locked into place, and as a result, you don't have the option. That sort of answers the question: why don't you jump in and then jump out again? Why don't you? Well, sometimes you can't do that, right? Sometimes you have to be sort of the more mobile fort. And so you've got to defend something. So you've got to have big guns and you've got to have armor because you're sort of locked into the defensive. Stephen Ross says there was one scratch-built stealth fighter that had FTL. I didn't remember that the Blackbird had FTL. I could stand corrected on that. I need to rewatch the show, and that would be an excellent thing for us to all watch together. So we should have like a group watch along thing at some point. I'll come back to that, the other comments that I'm seeing at the end. So next is the Jovian Chronicles type. Now, what do I mean by this? This is basically what I talked about last week when I'm calling the Presby model. And that is this idea that you've got a vector movement type of situation where you've got a large ship that has a high efficiency drive that over a long period of time can put a tremendous vector on something on its, it can put a tremendous vector on the ship. And when it deploys its carried craft, those carried craft are high performance, but they are low endurance. They don't have a lot of capability to change the vector. And so the entire group is sort of moving along. And in that situation, you really need the carrier, because the carrier in this model also is providing the strategic mobility. It's just not doing it through an FTL jump. It's providing the strategic mobility by putting the majority of the vector, and basically you can have a cloud of fighters that come out of it and go off and do stuff, but they have to come back to the carrier because the carrier is the one that's really going to maneuver them onto a new vector. So like if you've only got a total of, say, 20 kilometers per second in your fuel tanks of your fighters, but the carrier has put on a vector of 100 kilometers per second, right? You're limited to 80 kilometers to 120 along that axis, and then whatever you can do on the side axis. So basically the carrier has defined your vector, the biggest definition of your vector. And so you end up having to come back to the carrier again. And so in that case, you may or may not, depending upon the performance of your carried craft, the performance of your fighters, you may or may not wade into the fight. In the example that I drew, sorry, it's been a long week and it's been a long day. In the example that I drew there, down at the bottom, the carrier sort of pulls away. It's trying to stay out of that fight. It's trying to let its fighters go off and do the fight. But if you don't have a whole lot, under certain circumstances, you might find yourself in a situation where the carrier, the carried craft, the carrier is going to wade right into the fight itself. It's going to have to. Depends upon how many fighters you've got. It depends upon what the enemy looks like. Depends upon what that vector looks like. There could be situations where you just really can't change things enough for it to matter. There may be situations where, like, you've got a big spinal mount and you need that as part of the battle. So there's all sorts of ways, all sorts of reasons why you might conclude that you would wade in with your carrier in that situation. Okay, so CJ Cherry's Alliance Union universe. In that, carriers provide the strategic mobility in the form of the FTL jump drive, but they also provide the primary offensive punch. This is an interesting universe. It's a very interesting universe because carriers are just as fast as writers, or at least we think they are. It's hard to tell because the way CJ Cherry writes with her limited third-person viewpoint, but carriers appear to be just as fast as writers. And at least when the carrier is using the FTL drive to accelerate. So why would you use the riders then? Why do you need them? Well, it allows you to spread out the offense. You can engage multiple targets and have multiple missions. It allows you to spread out the offense. It lets you do dangerous things without putting the full carrier complement at risk. Allows you to increase enemy uncertainty, and I should have been more specific about that on the slide. And that's because the riders apparently are harder to see than the carrier is, and so there's a whole bunch of reasons why you might do that. This is also very similar to the last one in that the impression you get is that the carrier puts the biggest chunk of that vector onto the fighters, at least when they leave. Although the riders do seem to have pretty capable engines. It's unclear what the endurance is, although in Down Below Station itself, we see riders that have been out on patrol throughout the system, so it can't be too limited. And so those riders, though, are really not like fighters. They're really closer to being torpedo boats. And I do want to do an episode on the Lofudra. I need to research the Lofudra and sort of the implications of carrying torpedo boats. There's a couple of good sources for that, that I talked about earlier. That's going to be part of this eventually. I just haven't gotten to there yet to talk about that more. So that's really kind of a different model in that in this one, the carrier is just as capable. It's just useful to have the riders along. Okay, so here's a summary of how I think this all fits together. In the original Battlestar Galactica, the carrier has a traditional carrier role. It's focused on the defense, and you try to keep it out of the battle if you possibly can, although they failed on a weekly basis. The role of the fighters in that is both offensive and defensive. They're the primary combat capability. They do everything. Now, I talked about pew pew not making sense. What I mean by that is, in that original show, the only weapon the fighters had was just their turbo lasers. This is sort of the equivalent of sending out Grumman Hellcats to attack enemy ships with their 50 cals. I'll just strafe them with the 50 cal. Okay, you could do that all day long and it's not going to matter. So even fighters when fighters have bombs on board, they're fighter bombers at that point. They're strike aircraft. And so strike aircraft is how you sink enemy ships. Strike aircraft is how you attack, you do a number on ground targets. Yes, it's always useful to strafe stuff, especially if you're strafing something like a destroyer. You could kill guys. Destroyers are lightly armed. You can screw them up pretty bad. But when push comes to shove, if you want to sink something and drop a bomb on it, you don't shoot it with a 50 caliber bullet. And the original Battlestar Galactica did the equivalent of shooting stuff with a 50 caliber bullet, much more than it did. There wasn't anything that looked like a bomb, right? At least in Star Wars, you had the proton torpedoes to destroy the Death Star. He didn't try blowing up the Death Star by pew-pewing it. Okay, the new Battlestar Galactica, the Galactica itself had both an offensive and a defensive role. It was the primary strategic mobility through its FTL drive, so it sort of defined the range. It was the one that moved the fighters around. The fighters didn't have any strategic mobility. The Vipers had no strategic mobility without the Galactica. And I would argue that their default doctrine was to jump into combat and deploy their stuff when they were going on the offensive, at least. The role of the Vipers was both offensive and defensive, and I really think their doctrine was about combat launch and recovery, which we didn't see much in the show because of the particulars of them, the level of resources they had, etc. But I really think that that's what they were designed to do. And those are the big caveat. What stands out about this is that we don't really see what they normally do because we've got one Battlestar and it's trying to shepherd all these other ships, et cetera, et cetera. And they're limited in weapons, they're limited in resources, and their tactics are modified because of these limitations and because they're strictly in a defensive role. In Jovian Chronicles, the role of the carrier seems to be both offensive and defensive. In fact, I was reading something about that earlier today, and there was some comment about how the one side in it just really doesn't believe in exo armors, or that wasn't really what their doctrine is about. Their doctrine was about big fleet units doing their thing to the degree that they could. The big ships have a significant combat contribution, and the primary strategic mobility in this case is with the carriers, but in this case it's STL. It's slower than light. But it is really about the big ship putting the vector on. And this fits into what I call the Presby model, which is this idea that you really need to sort of look at it both in terms of like the reference frame that looks around, that's based upon the ship that's deploying the fighters, as well as how that entire blob moves through space over time. From a fighter role, they seem to be both offensive and defensive in this case. And you don't see this as much in fiction as I really think that you should. Seems to me that there should be more about this, and there just doesn't seem to be. And there was something else I was going to say about it that I forgot to write down, and now I can't remember what it is, but if I do, I'll come back to it. So in Cherry's Alliance Union universe, the carrier are primarily offensive and defensive. It provides a strategic mobility for the writers as well. So the carrier, I mean, if you lost all your writers, your carrier still has really significant combat capability. Now, if you lost the carrier, the writers all die, right? And so one of the things in those books is that the primary rule is you have to cover your carrier. And if you have to sacrifice writers to get the carrier away, you do it, because, you know, there's no such thing as sacrificing the carrier to save the writers. The writers will die because the carrier is the primary strategic mobility. The writers in that case have both an offensive and a defensive role. I wouldn't say it's the primary role, but, you know, they work in concert and they have a lot of capability and they're able to use it. Cherry in one essay specifically says that the carriers have more capability than the writers do, but a writer can really, really ruin your whole day. If you're a carrier and you get hit by the other guy's writers, you could find yourself in a world of hurt and being basically fresh meat for the enemy carrier. And the thing that really stands out about this is that the carrier performance is incredibly high, in part because it's got that FTL capability, because she talks about in Hellburner about them running the warp bubble up and then collapsing the FTL bubble before they actually go into FTL, and they accelerate past and stuff like that. It's really well thought out. Okay, so I'm going to do questions, but next time I think I'm going to talk about assumptions in all of this. Assumptions about drives, assumptions about sensors, assumptions about weapons, and how all those things sort of fit together. It's a talk I probably should have tried to do earlier, but I haven't. But I'm going to try to do this now. And I think it's going to be planning on this for the 26th of August. So not next week, but the weekend after. And we'll see how that works out. Although if it turns out Pat's available, we'll end up talking about Babylon 5 instead at that point. Okay, so now I'm going back to the front, and let's see what we've got in terms of questions and stuff like that. Right before the show started, said we're all in the pattern on the glide slope, carrier reference. So for what it's worth, I've been on the landing signal officer's platform of an aircraft carrier watching planes land. It was actually pretty cool. Been on the flight deck watching them take off. And then after the last ones took off on the flight deck, we walked to the LSO platform about 500 feet away and sat there and watched planes land for a while until an F-14 came in a little bit rough and hit hard enough for its landing gear to break and get driven up into a fuel tank, at which point a smell of kerosene came wafting over us. And they said, yeah, it's going to take them a while to clear the deck. We're done for a while. And so we all went back to whatever we were doing before we came up to watch flight ops. Stephen Ross asked the question, any chance I'll talk about those Japanese destroyers that carry F-35 squadrons? I will now. And so what he's referring to is that the Japanese don't operate aircraft carriers, but they operate something that looks an awful lot like a U.S. amphib, about the same size, more or less, that they call a destroyer, like an aviation destroyer or something like that. I can't remember exactly how they phrase it. And they originally talked about helicopters, but it looks like they're going to do F-35s off of it also. So a couple of thoughts on that. One is F-35 has an incredibly hot engine, and when it lands, the thrust is pointing directly down. So we learned that we had to change our flight decks in order to not burn off all the non-skid that they put on the flight decks. And I don't know exactly how they solved that problem, because when I stopped working for the Center for Naval Analysis, there were no F-35s in the fleet yet. And so they had identified it as a problem that they had not yet solved. So I don't know what the exact solution to that was. There's other things that you need in order to make that work. If you're going to have lots of flight ops, it takes a little bit more effort. Like you have to be able to generate a critical mass in your flight deck. So like if you're elevator limited, or if you've got some other limit that prevents you from doing stuff, that's potentially a problem. The other thing is making sure that you can have a meaningful capability on the airplane. And so as the general rule of thumb is that if you want high performance, heavy aircraft with heavy weapons loads, you need a catapult. And if you don't have that, you're sort of limited. And so like the Russians with the Kuznetsov class, they've got a ski jump, which helps some, but they weren't really able to do long range strike. They did a little bit of strike in Syria, which was primarily because they weren't going very far and they weren't carrying very many bombs at the time. But if you want to do like the US does, if you want to have a plane that looks like, all right, let's take a minute. You want a plane that's got a bunch of weapons like that. In fact, that's not even a bunch for an F-14 or for an F-18. If you want to have a plane that's got a bunch of weapons like that, then you really need to have a catapult to get that plane in the air. And so it's unclear to me what exactly those Japanese, what the capabilities of those Japanese destroyers are going to be or not. It's also, there's a doctrinal thing about this. I don't know what their doctrine is going to be about that. The Russians called the Kuznetsov the heavy aircraft carrying cruiser. And a lot of people like to just claim it's a cynical ploy because the Montreux Convention says that you can't take aircraft carriers through the strait out of the Black Sea, and that this is just through the Dardanelles, and that this is just a cynical ploy on their part. Well, the Turks can always throw the flag on that, right? It's not like the Turks are going to say, "Oh, well, I guess I stand corrected. That's not an aircraft carrier," right? I think it really is actually that's how they use it. The Russians have never thought in terms of, we have an aircraft carrier and we build everything else around it. They think in terms of, they have surface combatants, and aircraft carriers, their heavy aircraft carrying cruiser is a supplement to their surface capability, which incidentally is what US Navy doctrine was circa 1920. Later than that, 25, 30, something like that. At some point, it turned into large offensive capability on the aircraft carrier itself. But for a long time, it was all about scouting and maybe some self-defense and stuff like that. And that's really what the Russians do in that. And I don't know what the Japanese have planned for it. It'll be interesting to see. TJ said, if you replace thrust with mobility, the new Battlestar Galactica jump drive fills the exact same role. That's really kind of what if I understand his comment, that's really kind of what I'm saying here. Let's see. There's lots of talk about all the old people in the audience talking about watching Apollo. Let's see. Right. Yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of the battleship. The only issue is I may not know until late Friday if I'm going to go early Saturday. So we should coordinate. So Wilhelm says Stargate was utterly stupid as a TV show. I'm going to respectfully push back on that. I actually really like Stargate. And there were times where, you know, okay, the entire universe looks like the Pacific Northwest, and there's a few other issues here and there. But there are things about Stargate that I just really like. Like, for instance, in Stargate Atlantis, they spent an entire season where they were constantly trying to improve their strategic position in what is it, the Pegasus Galaxy, if I remember correctly. They were trying to improve their strategic.
As someone who's been watching Stargate Atlantis, yes, it is the Pegasus Galaxy. Yeah.
Thank you. I need to rewatch it. I've watched it all. I just haven't done it in a while.
Yeah, I periodically will pull Atlantis back up because, like, don't get me wrong, I love Stargate, like SG-1, but like Atlantis brings in a lot of fun dynamics with here's a bunch of the old ancient technology that we can play around with, like the mysticism and everything.
Yeah, and I really liked how the fact that they spent an entire season trying to improve their strategic position in the galaxy, and everything they did blew up in their face and made them worse off than they were before it started. Like, I remember one episode where they figured they've got a line on being able to get another ZPG, and so
ZPM,
0-point module, not 0-point generator. They're trying to get another ZPM, and in the process of trying to get the other ZPM, they not only fail to get a second ZPM, but they almost exhaust their first one.
Yep.
So there was all sorts of things where they tried to do stuff and it just didn't work out. And I really kind of like that. Now, there's a few places where I thought that they, like, there was a few storylines where it's like, why did you resolve that so fast? There's a few things with the replicators that it's like, oh, okay. The replicators I thought were always sort of not as useful or not as interesting as they could have been. But by and large, I just really like those shows. Although I will admit, I've never watched Stargate Universe. I've got it. I've just never watched it.
Universe is okay. I wish it had gotten more because, like, at the end of everything, it's like, this is what you're ending with?
They ended on a cliffhanger. So I'm looking forward to watching it. I've got them all. They're all sitting right over there on the DVD shelf. So I need to do that at some point.
Yeah, I'm in the process of rewatching Atlantis again.
I need to do that. So let's see. Wright asked whether Geyer was an S3 Viking guy. As it turns out, I can't remember what type of squadron he was assigned to. He was not a pilot. He came out like right about the time the post-Vietnam drawdown was going to happen. And so they didn't send him off to flight school. They sent him off to be an officer in a squadron, but they didn't send him to flight school first. And then because of the Vietnam drawdown, they were offering people basically, if you were an academy grad, they basically said, we'll just waive the requirement that you serve like 5 years to pay for your education. And so he did one at-sea tour. They gave him the out and he pulled the handles and left the aircraft and went off into civilian life. And so I don't know what type of squadron he was, but he didn't have a flying role. He was flying a desk. Wilhelm asked me if I ever read Ward Carroll's Punk's War. I have not read Punk's War. I've had a little bit of interaction with Ward Carroll. We've exchanged emails before, and I watch his YouTube videos haphazardly. I haven't watched them all, but I've watched a bunch of them. But I have not read Punk's War, and I probably should. Okay. So Rob points out we do see fighter-sized craft with a jump drive. I don't know that we see. depending upon whether Blackbird actually had one or not, we don't see, I think, colonial ships with one. We see Cylons with it, but the Cylons seem to be at a higher tech level than the colonials are. But yeah, I mean, you pay a performance penalty when you add mass on it. So there's issues when you do that, and you know there's you're designing to a specific requirement. You're trying to get to a particular place, and if you start adding other stuff onto it, you have a problem. So, for instance, you can add bombs onto something like a Hellcat, right? You can add hardpoints. You can actually drop bombs, but you're not going to be dropping a torpedo from a Hellcat. And the things that were designed to carry torpedoes in World War II were not particularly good fighters. They did occasionally do that, the fighter role. They're early on in the war at one point, in order to conserve the fighters for some reason, they were in a defensive position and they needed to do a cap, and they put a bunch of torpedo planes, sans torpedo, but they put a bunch of torpedo planes up on cap and said, congratulations, you're the air defense. And that did not go well. I think it went better than it could have, and that I don't think they lost any ships in the process. But the experience was such that they went, yeah, we're not going to do that again. That's not an experience worth repeating. So they didn't repeat it. Okay, Rob, let's see. Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying, Rob. He says, I agree the Battlestar is expected to wade into the flight in new BSG because it's more based around the jump-based alpha strike where the ship ends up close, or that the fight may come to it in like an ambush or something. And I think that's exactly what's going on. Okay, Rob also says Blackbird has an FTL drive. TJ points out it's a plot point. All right, I surrender. It has a FTL drive. I just simply didn't remember that. So I need to go back and rewatch it. I haven't really watched Battlestar Galactica since the first time through. I've been meaning to, but there's just, there are 4 years of it to go through. So I have watched Blood and Chrome and Razor a couple of times, but I just haven't watched the whole series. Okay. All right. I'm scrolling through. Yep, Cylon fighters have FTL capabilities. They certainly do. And I don't talk about Cylon doctrine here, because I think we see even less of Cylon doctrine, because they're, to the degree that their viewpoint, they're not. We don't see them talking about tactics. We don't see how they're trying to do stuff. I don't have a good feel for exactly how they work in that regard. And they also have they seem to have a greater level of technology than the colonials do. And so because of that, I don't have as good a feel for exactly what the Cylons are capable of and what they think their doctrine is. But I've often said that if I were the Cylons, I'd put a nuke on every one of those fighters, and with instructions that they're to get as close as they can to the Galactica and then do a suicide run. So a force where all of your pilots get immediately resurrected if they engage in a kamikaze run is a force designed for kamikaze runs, right? And yes, I know that they said the process is not particularly pleasant, but on the flip side, it would be incredibly effective, and it would be over relatively quickly. And this actually goes back to one of the things that I've often said that was most disappointing about Battlestar Galactica, is you've got all these inconsistencies all the way through it. And, the Cylons have a plan. Now, it turns out in the plan that they came up with, the plan was really pretty stupid. But this was a great opportunity for, as more and more of these facts come in and they're putting it all together, to see Adama and Ty going like, I don't understand why we're not dead. Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I don't understand why we're not dead either, right? There was a great opportunity for there to be some folks in the fleet going, this does not make sense. We do not understand something really, really important. Tiny little hints of that every now and then, but they never really got into that. They were too busy having civil strife and stuff like that. I would have liked to see it be a little bit more about trying to figure out what was going on and a little bit less about people not getting along. Wright says, in a wet Navy comparison, U.S. Navy CVNs have a near FTL capability with their nuclear reactors, CVN 65 specifically. Yeah, in fact, if you were going to deploy, if you're in the middle of the Pacific and you deploy your fighters, and the carrier for some reason goes away, what do the fighters do? Most of them die. If you're close enough to land, maybe you're close enough to land and you can go back. But if you can bingo to a divert field. But if you're not, they go away. So all the strategic mobility of that comes from the fighters or from the carrier. Now, it's a little bit different on planet Earth in that, theoretically the Air Force can come in with some big wing tankers or even Navy organic tanking, although it'd be really difficult to do it with organic tanking. You can drag the airplanes across the Pacific, right? If you need to fly fighters across the Pacific, you can do it. It's just a long ass trip, and they've got a tanker that they have to tank every so often on the way there. There's no real equivalent of that in a lot of these science fiction shows because the distances are just so much bigger. When push comes to shove, you can fly around the Earth in an airplane with some tanker support. You're limited. That does not translate well into science fiction terms. Okay. Entropy 11 said, Stargate was smart until season 7 or so. Fair enough. Later Stargate isn't necessarily everyone's cup of tea. And then Eric Henry says that he disagrees. He thought it was lame until Ben Browder and the Ori showed up. I like it all. I think it's all fantastic. Okay, let's see. Mark Vaughn points out that there was an incident when Cylon raiders packed with explosives made suicide attack runs on the Galactica in Fire in Space. Yeah, the thing is that you didn't see the Vipers have any weapon other than pew pew, and most of what the Cylons did was pew pew. I mean, that's the only time you really saw anything different than pew pew, and so there was never any discussion about it. There was never any indication they had any other capability. They really just didn't think it that well through. Yeah, Wright points out that SPDs were used as poor man's cap at Coral Sea. That's the one I'm thinking about, I think. Although I was thinking it was sometime around Guadalcanal. Maybe they were at Coral Sea also, but I was thinking it was later during the extended campaign at Guadalcanal after Midway. Let's see. Brant Guillory just saying hi from work. Yeah, Rob says, but like you and I said, there may be a decision adding the jump drive to the fighters isn't worth the mass as long as we design the Battlestar to support it right. I'm going to mention it, and then I'm not going to go down this path. There's a similar thing we see in Star Wars with FTL-capable fighters on the side of the Rebels and TIE fighters that don't have any FTL capability. I'm not going to pull that thread because I do not analyze Star Wars because I don't think that there's enough consistency there to analyze Star Wars. That way madness lies. But it is interesting. It is interesting, that trade-off that gets made. Okay. Rob says they could build a Viper with FTL. He previously said, I think to put something in the slide, I'd say that we see the Colonials have that capability, which is FTL in their fighters, but they clearly have a reason not to use it. They could build a Viper with FTL. They don't do it. It's like we probably could build a carrier-capable Mach 3 airplane, but we find it better not to because the roll doesn't work. I think it's actually, let me put a slightly different spin on it. We find the trade-off to be too onerous. We've had, I think the Vigilante was Mach 3 capable. I could be wrong on that, but what we did, it didn't buy us anything. We lost a lot and it didn't buy us anything. And I think that's what's going on there. The Blackbird had some limited capability. And in all honesty, I think the idea of adding the FTL to it actually doesn't necessarily help. I don't think it's consistent with what we see from a technology standpoint. But aside from that, they're clearly looking for something in their fighters. They were clearly had some, their requirements document said this is what we're looking for, and the FTL capability didn't help them get what they got. And the thing is, people always, talking about the trade-off is actually a pretty easy place to go in all this, right? Because that's something that everybody sort of sees. Like, if I want to have you don't see a Lamborghini with a pickup bed, because the sorts of constraints that you have with a pickup bed on your vehicle are not the same sort of constraints that a Lamborghini would have. But the discussion, the next level discussion on all that is, can you maintain it? What's it cost? We have gotten rid of systems on various ships because they were not worth the cost. We could put them on, but it just wasn't worth it, both in terms of the acquisition cost and the cost to maintain it over time. There's this assumption that every platform is better, faster, cheaper. Well, not cheaper, but better, faster than the platform that came before it. And that's just simply not true. Frequently, it's not true. Happens all the time that it's not true. Like, for instance, the Spruances had some amazing gear, some amazing electronic gear that they did not put on the Arleigh Burkes. And it's because that gear was there as part of a specific targeting system for the Tomahawk anti-ship missile. We took the Tomahawk anti-ship missile out of the fleet, and so we didn't include the gear. And so when the sprue cans all left the fleet, we lost some capabilities. Now, sometimes you make them up in other areas, right? Sometimes it's a redundant capability. And so, like, okay, you bring something else in to do it. But in sometimes you just sort of say, you know what? I want to take the mean time between failures from 500 hours to 3,000 hours. And if I can do that by getting rid of that system, I'll do that. And, we don't have any idea how expensive FTL is in that. I'm actually kind of surprised they were, I need to go back and rewatch that episode, because I'm just kind of surprised they were able to fit it in, but they did. Let's see. Bob points out that plot armor is the strongest armor of all, and that is indeed true. Wilhelm asks, what are my opinions of the Russian military capabilities? I think that they haven't spent a whole lot of time dealing with the fundamentals in a long time, and I think that when you have a kleptocracy that has corruption at the top, the corruption spreads down to the bottom, and you end up with an inability to judge the capability of your own forces. I think that Russian aircraft designers are really quite good. I think that Russian submarine designers are really quite good, or at least they have been in the past. That having been said, if you want to pull the thread on that, I would check out on YouTube. There's a guy named Perun, Perun, who has some fantastic videos on these sorts of topics. He is an Australian defense economist, if I remember correctly, and his stuff is really, really worth watching. He started off doing a war game channel. The Russians invaded Ukraine, and now he's doing a military analysis channel, and it's definitely worth going back and taking a look at, and he's very entertaining as well. Okay, TJ tells me that the Vigi was only a Mach 2 plane. That could be fine. That actually doesn't surprise me. Mach 3 is really kind of hard. Mach 2 is reasonably easy. As far as these things go, Mach 3 is really kind of hard. And we just really haven't had a reason to do one. So we don't. And with that, I think that we are done. So Lissa is giving me the big thumbs up that we're done, because the hour-long show has lasted only 71 minutes, which is not quite a record short show.
It's not as bad as it could be.
No,
but it's definitely past when we designate time.
Well, I'm reminded that when I was working on my master's degree at the Naval War College, I was doing faculty by day, student by night. And when at one point they told me that the night classes were 2 hours and 45 minutes long. And at one point they had been listed as 2.5 hours long, and they got all these negative comments from the students about the fact that they always went 15 minutes over. And then they started listing them as 3 hours long, and they got all these positive comments from the students about how they always finish 15 minutes early. So I'm not suggesting that we start saying that the show is an hour and a half long, because it's bad for me to even have those thoughts. But maybe that's the way to look at it.
If we need to, we need to,
And, every now and then somebody says, you spend a lot of time, bantering and stuff like that. And I've always resisted temptation to cut that out. And that's because, we do this on a regular basis. I see a lot of the same people each week. We talk about what's going on in our lives, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yeah.
Some of that comes through, et cetera.
That's why I don't give you shit about it.
Yeah, I know, but it's worth actually putting that marker down on the record that we could make it shorter. We could, but because it's not like Lissa came on about 20 minutes before the show started, if I remembered correctly. I came on a couple of minutes before that, so we talked for about 20 minutes before the show started. So we could have done the entire banter phase before we ever got on the air, but I like it when cats show up on YouTube, when kittens show up on YouTube. I like having a little bit of conversation about those things, so I think it's worth it.
I've got an Esri there. Chandra, I think, is in the other room with Robert, and Kira is probably on the bed in Opa's old room. Most likely. That's usually her spot.
That sounds fantastic. But so I think we can declare victory for tonight. Like I said, at some point, I think it is almost inevitable. As I sort of work through this, at some point, I'm going to, the version of the Carriers in Space talk that I did on this show was version 2.0 of that talk. And so at some point, I'm going to do version 3 that might actually get split up into 2. When I'm able to sort of pull it all together and systematize it and make the slides look nice, et cetera, I will bring it back on the show. And hopefully we can have more of a discussion then. I'll probably put in something about the Blackbird having an FTL engine because it has an FTL engine. Maybe I'll get a chance to go back and rewatch that stuff between now and then. And I just there was a long list of things that I wish, it's like, oh, I wish I had time to go do this to research it for tonight. But got my marker down, need to sort of think about it and flesh it out a little bit more. But I wanted to do that in front of everybody else. So thank you very much, everybody. And with that, have a good weekend.
Have a good one, guys. Bye.